They called her defective. The Moonridge Pack stripped Lisa of her name, her rank, and her future the night they banished her to the frozen woods. A wolf shifter who couldn't shift, an Omega so broken even her own kind couldn't bear to look at her. They left her to die in the wilderness, in a crumbling hut where the forgotten go to fade away. But the pack didn't know that Lisa's inability to transform wasn't weakness. It was a dormant power, so rare, so ancient, that it had been suppressed by forces beyond her understanding. And they didn't know that on a brutal winter night, Harold Crowe, the Lycan Lord himself, he would collapse, bleeding at her door in cursed wolf form, his fate bound to hers in ways that would shatter everything they believed about worthiness, power, and destiny. By the time the pack discovered what she'd done, it would be too late. The defective Omega would become a silver wolf, the dying beast would become a king, and those who cast her out would face the reckoning of their lives. Welcome back if you crave forbidden compassion, impossible transformations, and a love powerful enough to rewrite destiny itself. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new here, because this is a story about two outcasts who became legends. The wind howled through the skeletal trees like the forest itself was screaming, battering the warped wooden walls of the hut with snow and ice. Lisa sat huddled by the dying embers of her fire, a threadbare blanket wrapped around shoulders too thin, too fragile for someone who should have been born a predator. The cold bit through every crack in the structure, but she'd stopped feeling it weeks ago. Cold was just another constant now, like hunger, like loneliness, like the shame that sat heavy in her chest with every breath. 3 months since the banishment. 3 months since Elder Elizabeth had stood before the assembled pack and declared her unworthy of the Moonridge name. 3 months since she'd walked into these woods with nothing but the clothes on her back and a certainty that she deserved every bit of it. Because Lisa couldn't shift. 18 years old and still trapped in human form while pups half her age ran through the trees on 4 legs, their wolves singing with freedom she would never know. The pack had tried everything. Forced transformations during the full moon, ritual ceremonies led by their strongest alphas, even painful injections of distilled wolf essence that left her screaming and still heartbreakingly human. Nothing worked. She was broken, defective, less than Omega. She was nothing. The scratch came just after midnight. At first, Lisa thought it was another branch scraping against the door, torn loose by the violent wind. But then it came again, deliberate, weakening, desperate. The sound of claws dragging against wood with failing strength. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Nothing good came to her door. Nothing came to her door at all. But the scratching continued, growing fainter with each attempt, and beneath the howl of the storm she heard something else. A low, pained whine that made something deep inside her chest twist with recognition. Not human pain, animal pain, wolf pain. Lisa pushed herself to her feet, every instinct screaming at her to stay inside, stay safe, stay hidden. Wolves didn't come to humans for help. Wolves especially didn't come to her, the outcast who smelled wrong, who felt wrong, who existed in the terrible space between human and Lycan without belonging to either world. She reached for the door anyway. The hinges shrieked as she pulled it open, and the winter wind slammed into her with enough force to steal her breath. Snow swirled in the darkness, and for a moment she saw nothing but white and shadow. Then her eyes adjusted. The wolf lay collapsed across her threshold, massive even sprawled in the snow. His fur was midnight black, so dark it seemed to absorb what little moonlight filtered through the storm clouds. Blood stained the white powder beneath him, too much blood, spreading in a pool that steamed faintly in the frigid air. A gaping wound tore across his ribs, deep enough that she could see muscle and bone beneath matted fur. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Molten gold, ancient and impossibly aware. They locked onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak, and in that gaze she saw something that should have been impossible. Intelligence, authority, recognition. This was no ordinary wolf. This was no rogue animal seeking shelter from the storm. This was someone far more dangerous. The wolf's eyes flickered, consciousness dimming, and that desperate whine came again, weaker this time. He was dying. Right here on her doorstep, this magnificent creature was dying, and every survival instinct she'd developed in 3 months of solitary exile told her to step back inside and bar the door. Let nature take its course. Let him die. Stay safe. But Lisa had been left to die herself. She knew exactly what it felt like to lie in the snow and wait for the cold to take her, to know that no one was coming, that no one cared. She knew the specific agony of being deemed unworthy of saving. "You're too heavy," she whispered to the dying wolf, her voice hoarse from disuse. I'm not strong enough to." The wolf's eyes met hers again, and she saw the plea in them. Not for himself, she realized. For her. He was begging her not to become the thing they'd tried to make her heartless, empty, as cold as the wilderness that had been her prison. Lisa grabbed his front legs. It took 20 minutes to drag him inside. Her muscles screamed, her hands bled from gripping his fur, and twice she collapsed from exhaustion, certain she couldn't move him another inch. But she did. Somehow, impossibly. She hauled the massive wolf across her threshold and kicked the door shut against the howling storm. They lay together on the floor in the aftermath, both panting, both trembling. The wolf's blood soaked into the ancient floorboards. Lisa's arms shook so hard she could barely move them, but she'd done it. The wolf who couldn't shift had saved a wolf who couldn't speak. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, everything had changed, and neither of them knew yet that this single act of defiance, this choice to show mercy when the world had shown her, none had just set destiny into motion. The Lycan Lord had found his silver wolf. The curse's condition had been met. The pack's worst nightmare had begun. Lisa didn't know that dawn would bring the pack's hunters to her door. She didn't know that the wolf bleeding on her floor was Harold Crowe, king of all Lycans, trapped in beast form by a witch's curse. She didn't know that the moment she'd chosen compassion over self-preservation, she'd triggered something inside herself that had been sleeping for 18 years, waiting for exactly this moment. All she knew was that for the first time since her banishment, she wasn't alone, and for the first time in her life she'd chosen to fight instead of accept what the world said she deserved. The wolf was still breathing when Lisa finally got the door barred behind them. Barely. Each inhale rattled in his chest like bones shaking in a box, wet and labored and wrong. She collapsed against the wall, her own lungs burning, arms screaming from the effort of dragging a creature 3 times her weight across ice and splintered wood. She should feel afraid. That's what any sensible person would feel, trapped in a 12-by-12 hut with a predator the size of a small bear. But fear required energy Lisa didn't have anymore. And besides, she'd already made her choice the moment she'd opened that door. The wolf's golden eyes tracked her as she pushed herself upright, moving slowly so as not to startle him. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, just watched with that unsettling intelligence that made her skin prickle with awareness that this was no ordinary animal. "I don't know what I'm doing," Lisa whispered, more to herself than to him. Her medical knowledge extended to basic first aid for humans, and even that was limited. But the wound across his ribs was still bleeding, soaking into the floorboards in dark rivulets that reflected the firelight like liquid copper. She gathered what little she had, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey Alfred had left behind. Before the banishment, clean rags torn from her only spare shirt, a sewing kit with thread too thick for flesh but better than nothing. Her hands trembled as she laid them out beside the wolf's massive form. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. "I'm sorry." When she pressed the first whiskey-soaked rag to the wound, the wolf's entire body went rigid. A growl rumbled deep in his chest, not threatening, but pained, almost involuntary. Lisa's breath caught, waiting for teeth that could crush her skull, for claws that could rip her apart. Instead, those golden eyes found hers again, and the growl died. The wolf held perfectly still, muscles quivering with the effort of restraint, and let her work. Tears blurred Lisa's vision as she cleaned the wound, as she pressed the torn fabric against bleeding flesh, as she whispered apologies and useless comforts into the darkness. She'd been called weak her whole life, too soft, too human, unable to survive in a world that demanded strength and savagery. But here, in this moment, she was the only thing standing between this magnificent creature and death. Her gentleness, the very trait her pack had despised, was exactly what he needed. The wolf's breathing began to steady as she worked. The bleeding slowed, and when she finally tied off the makeshift bandage and sat back on her heels, exhausted beyond measure, the wolf did something that made her heart stutter. He dragged himself closer, inch by painful inch, until his massive head rested against her thigh. The gesture was deliberate, trusting, almost protective. Lisa's hand moved without thought, fingers sinking into blood-matted fur. "You're safe now," she whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. "I won't let anything happen to you." The wolf's eyes drifted closed, and for the first time since the banishment, Lisa felt something other than shame burning in her chest. She felt necessary. She felt seen. She felt like maybe, just maybe, being too soft had always been her greatest strength, not her fatal flaw. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside the forgotten hut, an Omega who couldn't shift kept watch over a wolf who wouldn't speak, and neither of them was alone anymore. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through the gaps in the walls like water through cupped hands. Lisa woke with her spine pressed against the cold floor, neck cramped from sleeping upright, still sitting beside the wolf. She'd meant to stay awake through the night, to monitor his breathing, to change the bandage if blood seeped through. Instead, exhaustion had claimed her sometime before dawn. She sat up slowly, wincing at the protest of stiff muscles, and immediately looked to where the wolf had been lying. Her breath caught. The wolf was standing. Not just standing, he was on his feet near the far wall, weight distributed evenly across all 4 legs, head held high despite the bandage wrapped around his torso. In the weak morning light, his black fur seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality, and those golden eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You should be dead," Lisa whispered. The wound that had been gaping and raw just hours ago was already closing beneath the makeshift bandage. She could see it in the way he moved carefully still, but without the trembling weakness of imminent death. His breathing was steady, strong, each inhale deliberate rather than desperate. It was impossible. Lycans healed faster than humans, yes, but not like this. Not overnight from injuries that should have taken weeks to recover from, if they recovered at all. The wolf took a step toward her, and Lisa's survival instincts finally kicked in. She pressed herself back against the wall, suddenly acutely aware that she was trapped in a 12 by 12 space with a predator who no longer needed her help. Who might decide that a lone Omega made an easy meal now that he had his strength back? But the wolf stopped immediately, reading her fear like words written across her face. He lowered himself to the floor in a gesture of submission that looked utterly wrong on a creature of his size and bearing. Those golden eyes never left hers, and in them she saw something that stole the fear right out of her chest. Gratitude. Deep, soul-wrenching gratitude mixed with something else, something that looked almost like reverence. "Who are you?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you?" The wolf's ears twitched forward, tracking every syllable. He watched her the way scholars watched ancient texts, like he was memorizing not just her words but the spaces between them, the tremor in her voice, the way her hands twisted in her lap. It was the gaze of someone who understood language, who wanted desperately to respond but couldn't form the words. Lisa had spent 3 months talking to herself, her voice the only sound besides wind and her own footsteps. But this felt different. This felt like conversation, even in silence. She gathered her courage and moved closer, reaching out with one trembling hand. The wolf remained perfectly still as her fingers touched the bandage, carefully peeling back the edge to examine the wound beneath. Her breath stopped. The gash that had exposed muscle and bone was now a thin pink line, raised but sealed, healing with supernatural speed. Around the edges, his fur had already begun to grow back, covering the trauma as if it had never existed. "This isn't normal," she breathed. "Even for Lycans. This isn't—" The wolf huffed softly, and Lisa could have sworn she heard agreement in the sound. He knew. Whatever he was, whoever he was, he knew exactly how impossible his healing was. She met those golden eyes again, and this time she saw layers she'd missed in the desperation of last night. Authority that had nothing to do with size or strength. Sadness that spoke of long imprisonment. And beneath it all, a fierce protectiveness directed entirely at her. "You can understand me, can't you?" Lisa asked. Every word. The wolf blinked once, deliberately, and pressed his massive head against her palm. The gesture was so gentle, so careful, that tears pricked her eyes. This creature, this powerful, dangerous, impossible creature, was treating her like she was precious, like she was worth protecting. No one had looked at her that way in 3 months. No one had looked at her that way ever. "I don't know what you are," Lisa whispered, her fingers sinking into his fur, feeling the warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath midnight black coat. "But I'm glad you're alive." The wolf's eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened again, Lisa saw a promise in them. He wouldn't forget this, wouldn't forget her. Whatever was happening, whoever he truly was beneath the beast form, he had bound himself to her in that moment of salvation. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving the world wrapped in fresh snow and dangerous silence. Inside the hut, an omega and a wolf, who should not exist, sat in the gray morning light, and between them passed an understanding that needed no words. Something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. Lisa just didn't know yet that by nightfall, her pack would come hunting, and the choice she'd made in darkness would be tested in blood and fire. The memory came uninvited as Lisa stirred the meager pot of broth over the fire, the wolf's steady gaze warm on her back. She'd learned to push the past away, to exist only in the present moment where survival demanded her full attention. But something about having another presence in the hut, about not being alone, had unlocked the door she'd kept so carefully barred. 3 months ago, the pack gathering under the full moon, Lisa had stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by wolves whose eyes glowed with their inner beasts. Alphas, betas, even the youngest omegas, all of them shifted, all of them whole. And she remained stubbornly, humiliatingly human, her skin bare under the moonlight that should have called forth her wolf. 18 years. Elder Elizabeth's voice had cut through the night like a blade, cold and precise. The old woman stood in human form, gray hair pulled back severe from a face carved with disapproval. 18 years we've invested in this defective child. Healers, ritual masters, even blood magic from the old ways. Nothing takes root, nothing transforms. She's just a late bloomer, her mother had pleaded, voice breaking. Some wolves don't shift until their 20s. She has no wolf, Elizabeth snapped. Look at her. Really look. There's nothing there. No inner light, no beast sleeping beneath the surface. She's hollow. A human wearing Lycan skin, poisoning our bloodline with her weakness. Lisa had wanted to defend herself, to argue, to prove them wrong. But she'd tried to shift so many times, pushed so hard during the full moons that she'd collapsed bleeding from the nose, screaming with the effort of reaching for something that simply wasn't there. How could she argue against the truth? The pack cannot carry dead weight, Alfred had said, stepping forward with the authority of the pack's head warrior. His face had been hard, unmoved by her mother's tears or the way Lisa trembled. Especially not now. With the territory disputes. We need strength. She is liability. Roland had nodded beside him, arms crossed. Every resource spent on her is wasted. Food, shelter, protection, all for someone who will never hunt, never defend, never contribute. She contributes, Alice had spoken up. One of the few voices in Lisa's defense. She's a skilled healer. She tends the young. Human work, Elizabeth interrupted. Work any human could do. We are Lycans. We do not keep pets. The words had landed like physical blows. Pets. As if Lisa was something domesticated and useless. Something that existed only at their mercy. The judgment is decided, Elizabeth had declared, and the finality in her voice left no room for appeal. Lisa, of no pack name, is hereby banished from Moonridge territory. She will be escorted beyond our borders at dawn and will not return on pain of death. We cast out what is broken. We do not let it weaken the whole. Her mother had sobbed. A few pack members had looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the elders. And Lisa had stood frozen, watching her entire world collapse into that single pronouncement. Unworthy, defective, broken beyond repair. They'd given her nothing but the clothes on her back and directions to the old hut deep in the woods. A place where banished wolves had died before, where the pack's unwanted went to fade from memory. Jeffrey had been the one to escort her, silent and efficient, depositing her at the threshold like cargo before disappearing back into the trees without a word. Lisa had stood at the door of the hut that would become her prison and tomb, and she'd understood with perfect clarity that the pack expected her to die. Hoped for it, even. Better a clean death than the lingering embarrassment of a defective omega, surviving to remind them of their failure. She'd almost obliged them. That first week, she'd barely eaten, barely moved, simply waited for the cold or starvation to finish what the pack had started. But spite was a powerful thing. And somewhere beneath the shame and grief, Lisa had found a stubborn core of rage that refused to give them the satisfaction. The wolf huffed behind her, pulling Lisa back to the present. She turned to find him watching her with those two knowing eyes, head tilted as if asking whether she was all right. "Just ghosts," she whispered, wiping roughly at her eyes. "They're just ghosts." But the wolf moved closer, pressing his solid warmth against her side, and Lisa realized that for the first time since the banishment, the ghosts didn't feel quite so heavy. She wasn't alone with them anymore. The knock came in the late afternoon, sharp and authoritative against the warped wood. 3 precise strikes that made Lisa's blood turn to ice. The wolf's head snapped up from where he'd been resting near the fire, ears flat against his skull, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that could tear through bone. A growl rumbled in his chest, low, dangerous, nothing like the pained sounds from the night before. "Cellar," Lisa hissed, already moving. "Now." She didn't know if he'd understand, didn't know if he'd obey, but the wolf was on his feet instantly. She threw open the trapdoor in the corner, barely large enough for a human to climb through, but she had no other options. The wolf looked at the narrow opening, then back at her, something like protest in those golden eyes. "Please," Lisa whispered urgently. Another knock, harder this time. "They can't find you. Please." The wolf held her gaze for one more heartbeat, then squeezed himself through the opening with impossible grace for something his size. Lisa dropped the trapdoor closed and kicked the threadbare rug over it just as the door shuddered under a third, more violent impact. "Open up, Lisa. We know you're in there." Alfred's voice. Of course it was Alfred. Lisa forced her breathing to steady, wiped her sweating palms on her worn dress, and lifted the bar from the door. 3 men stood on her threshold, all of them in human form, but radiating the barely contained violence of their wolves just beneath the surface. Alfred in front, broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, Roland beside him, hand resting on the knife at his belt, and Jeffrey lingering slightly behind, his expression carefully neutral. "What do you want?" Lisa's voice came out steadier than she felt. "The pack made it clear I'm not welcome. I've stayed beyond the borders like you demanded." "We're not here about you," Alfred said, though the disdain in his tone made it clear what he thought of her. His eyes scanned past her into the dim interior of the hut. "We're tracking a rogue wolf. Massive black beast, extremely dangerous. It attacked some of our hunters 2 days ago, killed one before escaping wounded into these woods." Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face blank. "I haven't seen any wolf. Just me out here." "Its trail leads this way," Roland said, stepping closer. "Blood trail. Lots of it. That thing should be dead or dying, and its tracks end near your hut." "Tracks end lots of places in snow," Lisa said, fighting to keep her voice level. "Wind covers them. Animals cross over them. I haven't seen anything." Alfred's eyes narrowed, and he pushed past her into the hut without invitation. Lisa's hands clenched into fists, but she couldn't stop him, not without force she didn't have. He stalked through the small space like he owned it, examining every corner with predatory focus. "You've been busy," he said, noting the bloody rags she'd forgotten to hide, still piled near the fire. "Cut yourself?" "Caught my hand on the woodpile," Lisa lied smoothly. "Splinters get infected out here. Have to be careful." Roland moved to the trap door, and Lisa's breath stopped entirely. His boot scraped across the rug, and for one terrible moment she was certain he'd pull it back, would discover the wolf hidden below, would kill them both. "There's nothing here," Jeffrey said quietly from the doorway. "The trail probably just got covered by the storm. We should keep searching the outer perimeter." Alfred turned slowly, suspicion written across every line of his face. He stared at Lisa like he could peel back her skin and read the truth written on her bones. "You're sure you haven't seen anything?" "Because harboring a rogue wolf is a death sentence, Lisa, even for someone already banished." "I haven't seen anything," Lisa repeated, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she didn't feel. "Just wind and snow, like always." The silence stretched between them, brittle and dangerous. Alfred's wolf pressed against the surface of his skin. She could see it in the way his eyes flickered amber, the way his muscles tensed with barely restrained violence. Then Jeffrey spoke again, carefully casual. "We're wasting time. That thing could be miles from here by now." Alfred held Lisa's stare for 3 more agonizing heartbeats, then turned toward the door. "If we find out you lied," he said softly, "banishment will be the least of your concerns." The 3 men left without ceremony, their footsteps crunching through snow as they disappeared back into the forest. Lisa stood frozen until she could no longer hear them, until silence wrapped around the hut like a shroud. Only then did she drop to her knees and pulled open the trapdoor with aching hands. The wolf emerged from the cellar like shadow made solid, his massive form somehow fitting through the narrow opening despite the impossible physics of it. He moved immediately to the door, pressing his nose to the gap at the bottom, scenting the air with focused intensity. Lisa could see the tension coiled in every muscle, the predatory awareness that said he was ready to fight if they returned. "They're gone," she whispered, though her own hands still trembled. "For now." The wolf turned those golden eyes on her, and Lisa saw the question there. Why? Why had she lied for him? Why had she risked the wrath of the only pack she'd ever known to protect a creature she'd met less than a day ago? She had no good answer. Or maybe she had too many answers, none of them rational enough to speak aloud. "They'll be back," Lisa said instead, moving to the window to scan the tree line. "Alfred doesn't give up easily. They'll search the area, set up patrols. We're trapped here until they move on." The wolf huffed, a sound that carried layers of frustration and agreement. He padded to the fire and lay down, but his ears remained pricked, tracking every sound from outside. Alert, watchful, a guardian despite his wounds. Lisa joined him on the floor, her back against the rough wall, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The adrenaline of lying to Alfred's face had burned through her reserves, leaving her hollow and shaking. "They said you killed someone," she said quietly. "One of their hunters." The wolf's ears flicked back, but he didn't look away from her, didn't deny it. In his eyes she saw acknowledgement, and beneath that, something that looked like regret. Not for defending himself, she could tell that much, but for the necessity of it. "Were you protecting yourself?" Lisa asked. "Or someone else?" The wolf held her gaze, and slowly, deliberately, he shifted his head in what could only be interpreted as a nod. Protection. Defense. Not senseless violence, but survival. Just like her choice to save him had been about survival. Not his survival, hers. The survival of the part of herself that refused to become cold, refused to become the heartless thing the pack had tried to make her. "I know what it's like," Lisa heard herself say, words spilling out in the strange intimacy of their shared danger. "To be hunted by people who used to know your name. To have them look at you like you're nothing. Less than nothing." The wolf shifted closer, closing the distance between them until his warmth pressed against her side. He was too large, too powerful, should have been terrifying in the confined space, but instead, Lisa felt safer than she had in months. "You're in exile too, aren't you?" she whispered. "That's why you understand. That's why you came to my door instead of anyone else's. Somehow you knew." The wolf's breath came heavy and deliberate, and when he looked at her this time, Lisa saw reflected in his gaze everything she felt. The loneliness, the rage at injustice, the soul-deep weariness of being judged and found wanting by those who should have protected you. The terrible weight of surviving when everyone expected wanted you to die. Exile, recognizing exile. Pain recognizing pain. Lisa's hand found its way into his fur, fingers threading through the thick softness at his neck. The wolf leaned into the touch, and she felt the rumble of contentment in his chest, the first sound of peace he'd made since arriving. "I don't even know your name," Lisa said softly. "I don't know where you came from or why you're cursed to this form, but I know what it feels like to have your identity stripped away, to be told you're broken beyond repair." The wolf turned his head, pressing his muzzle gently against her palm. His eyes drifted closed, and in the gesture Lisa read trust so complete it made her chest ache. He'd been alone too. For how long? She couldn't guess, but long enough to recognize the same desperate loneliness in her. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the patrol branches snapping, low voices carrying through the winter air. Alfred and his hunters, searching for the beast they believed was a monster. They would never understand that the true monster was the system that created outcasts, that punished difference, that demanded conformity or death. "We'll wait them out," Lisa murmured, her other hand joining the first in the wolf's fur, grounding herself in his solid presence. "However long it takes, you're safe here." The wolf's eyes opened, and the look he gave her held such fierce protectiveness that Lisa's breath caught. The promise was clear. He would keep her safe too. They were bound now, two exiles against a world that wanted them erased. The fire crackled. The patrol moved through the distant trees, and in the forgotten hut at the edge of the world, an Omega and a king sat in silence that spoke louder than any words, understanding each other in ways their respective packs never could. 2 days passed before the patrols thinned enough for Lysa to breathe without fear of discovery. 2 days of existing in whispers and careful movements, of rationing her meager supplies to feed them both, of learning the wolf's patterns and preferences through observation alone. He was fastidious about cleaning himself, spending long stretches grooming his fur with a precision that seemed almost meditative. He never took food until she'd eaten first, despite his larger size and greater need. And every night, he positioned himself between her and the door, a silent guardian keeping watch while she slept. On the third morning, Lysa finally worked up the courage to change his bandage properly. The wound had healed remarkably and possibly, but she wanted to clean it, to ensure no infection had set in during their confinement. "Hold still," she murmured, kneeling beside him with fresh rags and the last of the whiskey. "This won't take long." The wolf remained perfectly motionless as she carefully unwound the blood-stiffened fabric. The wound beneath had closed completely, leaving only a thin silver scar across his ribs. Lysa traced it gently, marveling at the speed of his recovery. "You're lucky," she said softly. Another inch deeper, and her words died as her fingers moved higher, brushing through the fur on his left shoulder. She felt it before she saw it, a ridge of tissue beneath the dark coat, deliberate and geometric. Not a scar from battle, something else. Lysa parted the fur carefully, and her heart stopped. Burned into the wolf's flesh, so old it had become part of his skin, was a mark she'd seen only in the ancient texts Elder Elizabeth kept locked away. A crest composed of 3 interlocking circles, surrounded by runic script so archaic, Lysa couldn't read it. But she didn't need to read it. Every Lycan child learned what this symbol meant, even if most would never see it in their lifetime. The royal crest of the Lycan throne. The mark borne only by those of the Crowe bloodline. The mark of kings. "No," Lysa whispered, her hand jerking back like she'd been burned. "No, that's not you, can't be." The wolf watched her with those impossibly golden eyes, and Lysa saw the truth written in them. Confirmation, acknowledgement, resignation. Harold Crowe, the Lycan Lord. The most powerful alpha in the known territories, ruler of the 7 great packs. The wolf whose mere name made alphas bow and omegas tremble. He'd been missing for 6 months, vanished without trace, his throne empty, his kingdom fractured by infighting among the regional packs scrambling for power in his absence. And he'd been here, on her doorstep, bleeding and dying in the snow, coming to her for salvation. Why? The word ripped from Lysa's throat, raw with panic and disbelief. "Why would you come here? Why would the Lycan Lord come to a banished Omega's hut? I'm nothing. I'm nobody." The wolf pushed himself to his feet, moving toward her with deliberate purpose. Lysa scrambled backward until her spine hit the wall, her mind reeling with implications she couldn't process. "They'll kill me," she gasped. "When Alfred finds out I've been hiding you, when the pack discovers I lied to them about you, they won't just banish me, they'll execute me. They'll say I kidnapped you, that I was working with whoever did this to you. They'll—" Harold closed the distance between them and pressed his massive head against her chest, directly over her racing heart. The gesture was gentle but unmovable, demanding she focus on him rather than the spiral of panic consuming her. Lysa's hands came up instinctively, gripping his fur like a lifeline. "I don't understand," she whispered against his neck. "How did this happen? Who cursed you? Why can't you shift back?" The wolf pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and Lysa saw layers of story there, betrayal, ambush, dark magic that even he didn't fully understand. But beneath all of it, she saw the same thing she'd seen that first night in the snow. Desperation, need. And now, she understood why. Harold Crowe hadn't collapsed at her door by accident. He'd been drawn here, pulled by something neither of them could name yet. The most powerful Lycan alive had sought shelter with the most powerless Omega in existence, and somehow, impossibly, it had been exactly right. "The curse," Lysa said slowly, pieces clicking together in her mind. "That's why you heal so fast but can't shift. You're trapped between forms. Stuck as wolf because something won't let you be human." Harold's ears flicked forward, agreement, encouragement. She was understanding. And if Alfred finds you, Lisa's throat tightened. He won't help you. He'll kill you. The packs are fighting over your throne, they want you gone. Whoever did this to you probably has allies in every territory, including mine. The wolf huffed, and Lisa heard bitter confirmation in the sound. He knew. He'd known from the beginning that coming to her was his only option. Not because she was strong or connected or capable of protecting a king, but because she was outside the system entirely. Invisible, forgotten. The very thing that made her worthless to the pack made her invaluable to him. Lisa's hands tightened in his fur, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Fear, yes, but also that same stubborn rage that had kept her alive through 3 months of exile. They'd cast her out as broken. They'd told her she had no worth, and now she held the fate of kingdoms in her hands. The knock came at dusk on the 4th day, so different from Alfred's aggressive pounding that Lisa almost didn't recognize it as a summons. 3 soft taps, then a pause, then 2 more. A rhythm she remembered from childhood, from playing hide-and-seek in the pack's territory when life had been simpler. George's rhythm. Harold tensed immediately, a growl building in his throat, but Lisa pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Wait," she whispered. "I know him. She hesitated. "He's different from the others." She opened the door a crack, and George stood on her threshold looking haunted. He'd always been slight for a Lycan, more scholar than warrior, with gentle eyes that had never quite fit the pack's aggressive culture. Now those eyes were shadowed with something that looked like guilt. "Lisa," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you. Alone." "I'm not alone," Lisa said, opening the door wider. If George was here to betray her, hiding Harold wouldn't matter anyway. George's eyes widened when he saw the massive black wolf behind her, but to his credit, he didn't run. Instead, something like recognition flickered across his face, followed immediately by fear. "Saints preserve us," he breathed. "The rumors are true. You actually found him. What do you want, George?" Lisa's voice came out harder than intended. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. "To tell you the truth," George said, stepping inside and closing the door quickly behind him. "Before Alfred comes back with more hunters. Before..." He stopped, running a hand through his hair with visible agitation. "Before it's too late to make any difference." Harold moved closer to Lisa, protective, and George raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because I've carried this secret for 3 years, and I can't anymore. Not when I know what they did to you." "What who did to me?" Lisa demanded. "The elders, Elizabeth specifically." George's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Your banishment wasn't because you couldn't shift, Lisa. It was because they were terrified you would." The words hung in the air like smoke, not quite solid enough to grasp. Lisa shook her head. "That doesn't make sense. I can't shift. I've never been able to." "Because they suppressed it," George interrupted, the words tumbling out now like he'd been holding them back for too long. "There's a prophecy, an old one, passed down through the elder lines. When kingdoms fracture and thrones fall vacant, the silver wolf will rise in shame to crown a king. Elizabeth found it in the old texts 15 years ago." Lisa's legs felt weak. "Silver wolf? The rarest bloodline. Born once in a generation, maybe less. They're healers and warriors both, capable of breaking curses that would destroy normal Lycans. George glanced at Harold, then back to Lisa. "They're the natural mates of true kings, designed by fate itself to balance power." "I'm not," Lisa's voice cracked. "I'm nothing. I'm defective. Everyone knows what Elizabeth wanted them to know," George said urgently. "When you were 5 years old, she brought in a witch. Not a healer, a dark practitioner from the borderlands. She paid her to bind your wolf, to suppress it so completely you'd never know it existed. The ritual almost killed you. You were sick for weeks, and everyone thought it was just childhood illness." The room tilted. Lisa grabbed the wall for support, her mind racing through fragmented memories. She did remember being sick, remembered fever dreams of silver light and a voice that sounded like her own, screaming to be let out. Remembered waking up feeling hollow, like something essential had been carved out of her chest. Why? The word came out broken. Why would she do that? Because the prophecy terrified her, George said. A silver wolf rising in shame meant the existing power structure would collapse. Elizabeth has controlled Moonridge for 40 years. The thought of some prophecy girl overthrowing her authority, of crowning a king that wasn't her choice, he shook his head. She couldn't allow it. So she made sure you'd never become a threat. Made sure you'd be exiled before you could awaken. The banishment, Lisa whispered. It wasn't punishment. It was preventative. They sent you out here to die. George confirmed, and the guilt in his voice was palpable. Exile to the old hut, where the cold and isolation would finish what the suppression started. Except, he looked at Harold again, understanding dawning. Except the prophecy found you anyway. The Lycan Lord, cursed and hunted, collapsed at the door of the one wolf who could save him, the silver wolf. Rising in shame exactly like the prophecy said, Harold made a sound not quite a growl, but something deeper. Confirmation. Recognition. He'd known. Somehow, through curse and darkness and desperate flight, he'd been drawn to her because fate had bound them together before either of them was born. Lisa's hands were shaking. My whole life, she said, voice raw. My entire life was a lie. Every time I tried to shift and failed, every time they looked at me with disgust, every moment I believed I was broken. You were never broken, George said gently. You were deliberately crippled by people who feared your power. And now, he glanced toward the window, where darkness was falling fast. Now Alfred knows something's happening. He can feel the shift in the territory, the way magic moves when prophecy starts to wake. He's coming back tomorrow with the full hunting party. If they find the Lycan Lord here, they'll kill you both before you have a chance to transform. Transform? Lisa's laugh came out bitter and broken. I still can't shift, George. Prophecy or not, I'm still... Harold stepped forward and pressed his head against her hand, those golden eyes burning with absolute certainty. And for the first time, Lisa felt it, a flicker of something deep inside her chest, something that had been sleeping for 18 years, behind walls of dark magic and calculated cruelty. Something silver. Something powerful. Something that was finally, ready to wake up. They came at dawn, just as George had warned. Lisa was awake when she heard them, not the careful approach of a patrol, but the deliberate march of warriors who no longer cared about stealth. 6 of them, maybe more, footsteps crunching through snow with brutal purpose. Harold was on his feet before the first knock, positioned between Lisa and the door, every muscle coiled with lethal intent. But Lisa saw the calculation in his eyes, the terrible arithmetic of 6 trained warriors against 1 cursed wolf and 1 powerless Omega. The door exploded inward before she could reach it, the bar splintering like kindling. Alfred stood in the threshold with Roland and 4 others behind him. All of them shifted to their half-forms, the dangerous space between human and wolf, where Lycans were strongest, fastest, most deadly. We know he's here, Alfred growled, his voice distorted by the partial transformation. Step aside, Lisa. This doesn't have to involve you. Yes, it does, Lisa said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. She moved to stand beside Harold, her human fragility stark against his powerful wolf form. You're not taking him. Alfred's laugh was ugly. You think you can stop us? A defective Omega playing hero? His eyes shifted to Harold, and recognition flickered there, followed immediately by cruel satisfaction. The mighty Lycan Lord, reduced to hiding behind a broken wolf who can't even shift. How far you've fallen, Harold Crowe. Harold's growl shook the floorboards, but Alfred just smiled. Kill them both, he ordered. The Lord's disappearance will remain a mystery, and the Omega who harbored him dies a traitor. Roland moved first, faster than Lisa's human eyes could track. She saw the flash of claws, felt the displacement of air as he lunged, and something inside her chest shattered. It felt like chains breaking, like walls crumbling, like a dam bursting after 18 years of impossible pressure. Light exploded from Lisa's skin, not warm firelight, but cold, pure silver that burned with the intensity of moonlight concentrated to a single point. Roland's scream cut off as the light hit him, throwing him backward through the doorway with force that shouldn't have been possible. He crashed into 2 other warriors, all 3 of them going down in a tangle of limbs. Lisa looked down at her hands and didn't recognize them. Silver light poured from her skin like liquid starlight, and beneath it, She could see her bones restructuring, muscles building mass, power flooding through her body in waves that made her gasp. Not a full shift. She was still fundamentally human-shaped, but something was changing. Something was breaking free. Impossible, Alfred breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. Elizabeth said the binding was permanent. Elizabeth lied. Lisa heard herself say, and her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before, layered with something ancient and furious. About everything. The rage came then, burning through her like wildfire. 18 years of believing she was broken. 18 years of shame and isolation and self-hatred. All of it built on deliberate cruelty. They had done this to her. They had carved out her soul and told her it was her own fault. Lisa moved, and the world bent around her. She crossed the distance to Alfred in a heartbeat, her silver-wreathed hand closing around his throat before he could react. The warrior who had escorted her to exile, who had looked at her with such contempt, now dangled from her grip like a child's toy. "You cast me out to die," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the power surging through her veins. "You told me I was worthless, that I had no place in the pack." Alfred clawed at her arm, his enhanced strength suddenly inadequate against whatever she'd become. His eyes were wide with shock and genuine fear. "But you were wrong," Lisa continued, squeezing just enough to make him gasp. "I was never defective. I was just locked away, caged by people too afraid to let me be what I was meant to be." She released him, letting him collapse to the floor choking. The other warriors had regrouped, flanking her in a loose semicircle, but none of them moved to attack. They could feel it now, the shift in power, the way the air itself seemed to bend around her. "Leave," Lisa commanded, and her voice carried the weight of something far older than her 18 years. "Tell Elizabeth and the elders that their prophecy is coming true. The silver wolf has risen, and she remembers every single betrayal." Roland was the first to move, scrambling backward toward the broken door. The others followed, even Alfred, who crawled before finding his feet and stumbling into the snow. They fled like prey before a predator, and Lisa stood in the wreckage of her hut watching them go, her entire body trembling with power she didn't yet understand. Harold moved to her side, pressing against her legs, and Lisa felt the silver light finally begin to recede. Her bones ached from the partial transformation, muscles burning with exhaustion, but beneath the pain, she felt something else. Wholeness. For the first time in her life, she felt complete. She dropped to her knees beside Harold, her arms wrapping around his neck, and the Lycan Lord, trapped in wolf form and hunted by his own kind, leaned into the embrace of an Omega, who had just discovered she was never an Omega at all. She was something infinitely rarer, something the world hadn't seen in generations. She was a silver wolf, and her awakening had only just begun. The silver light didn't fade completely. It pulsed beneath Lisa's skin like a second heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing moment rather than weaker. She could feel her wolf now, not as some distant, unreachable thing, but as part of herself that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. "I can feel it," Lisa whispered against Harold's fur, her voice trembling with wonder and fear. "It's not just power. It's like remembering something I never forgot. Like coming home to a place I've always lived." Harold pulled back to look at her, and in his golden eyes she saw encouragement, permission, the unspoken understanding that she needed to finish what had started, to complete the transformation that had been stolen from her 18 years ago. Lisa stood on shaking legs and walked to the center of the ruined hut. The morning sun streamed through the broken door, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. She closed her eyes and reached inward, toward the presence that had awakened in her chest. The wolf reached back. This time, there was no resistance. No walls of dark magic holding her back, no suppression binding her true form. There was only the natural flow of transformation, as easy as breathing, as inevitable as dawn after darkness. Lisa's body dissolved into silver light. She felt her bones reshape without pain, felt muscles reform and strengthen, felt her senses expand until she could hear the heartbeat of every living thing within 100 yards. When the light finally receded, she stood on 4 legs instead of 2, and the world looked entirely different. Everything was sharper, clearer, more alive. She could smell the fierce scent Alfred and his warriors had left behind, could taste the magic that still lingered in the air from her partial shift. And when she looked down at herself, she saw fur the color of moonlight, pure silver, that seemed to glow with its own internal radiance. A sound drew her attention, and Lisa turned to see Harold watching her with something like reverence in his golden eyes. He took a step forward, then another, until they stood nose to nose. And then something extraordinary happened. Light erupted from Harold's form, not silver like hers, but deep gold that burned with the authority of centuries of royal bloodline. His body convulsed, bones cracking and reforming, fur receding as human skin emerged beneath. The curse that had held him for 6 months shattered like glass, unable to withstand the presence of his destined mate. When the transformation completed, a man stood where the wolf had been. Harold Crowe was exactly as the stories described, tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders, and those same golden eyes that had haunted Lisa's dreams. But the stories hadn't mentioned the scars that covered his chest, evidence of the ambush that had left him cursed and hunted. They hadn't mentioned the exhaustion that lined his face, or the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for her. "Lisa," he said, and his voice was rough from months of disuse but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "My silver wolf, my salvation." Lisa shifted back to human form without thinking, the transformation as natural now as breathing. She stood before him naked and unashamed, silver light still dancing across her skin in fading patterns. "The prophecy," she whispered. "It was about us." "It was always about us," Harold confirmed, closing the distance between them. His hands cupped her face with a gentleness that contradicted his warrior's build, the silver wolf rising in shame to crown a king. "You were cast out, made to believe you were broken, so that when this moment came, no one could claim it was arranged. No one could say it was politics or strategy. It had to be pure compassion given freely, protection offered without expectation of reward. Your curse," Lisa said, understanding dawning. "It could only be broken by someone who chose you without knowing who you were. Someone who saved you, not because you were a king, but because you were wounded. Someone worthy," Harold said softly. "Someone whose heart was pure enough to break magic forged in betrayal and malice." His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Lisa saw everything in his eyes, gratitude, devotion, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "You are my mate, Lisa, my equal in every way. And if you'll have me, you will be my queen." The word should have terrified her. Queen. Her, the defective Omega who'd been exiled to die in the woods. But looking into Harold's eyes, feeling the bond that had formed between them over days of silence and shared exile, Lisa felt only certainty. "Yes," she said simply. Harold's kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, sealing a bond that fate had written generations ago. And when they finally pulled apart, both of them were glowing silver and gold light, intertwining like threads in a tapestry, visible proof of what they'd become together. They dressed in what remained of Lisa's meager supplies, Harold in clothes too small for his frame but serviceable enough. When they stepped through the broken door into the winter morning, they didn't look back at the hut that had been Lisa's prison and salvation. They walked through the forest side by side, and where they passed, the world itself seemed to acknowledge their union. Birds took flight in spirals of silver and gold. The snow beneath their feet melted in patterns that looked almost like blessings written in an ancient tongue. By the time they reached the border of Moonridge territory, word had already spread. The silver wolf had awakened. The Lycan Lord had returned. And together, they were walking toward the pack that had tried to destroy them both. Lisa wasn't afraid anymore. She had spent 18 years believing she was nothing, 3 months learning to survive as an outcast. But she had always been exactly what she was meant to be, powerful, compassionate, and absolutely unwilling to let cruelty win. The pack would answer for what they'd done. Elizabeth would face justice for her crimes. And the Lycan world would learn that prophecy wasn't something you could suppress or control. It was something that found you anyway, in a crumbling hut at the edge of the world, where an Omega who couldn't shift saved a king who couldn't speak, and together they became legends. Loved this journey? Subscribe and turn on notifications because tomorrow brings another story where the powerless discover they were destined for greatness all along.